On a spring day in 1945, columns of defeated generals filed into Allied prisoner collection points across Germany. Among the officers tasked with interviewing them was M. Cole, United States Army historian serving on General George's Third Army staff. Cole asked these German commanders a simple question: what American weapon had impressed them most during the war the generals had faced? Sherman tanks rumbling across the of Normandy. They had watched helplessly as fleets of B-17 bombers darkened the skies over their cities. They had witnessed the devastating power of American artillery that seemed to have unlimited ammunition, yet their answer surprised Cole. The weapon that impressed them most was not a tank, not a bomber, not a gun. It was a small, boxy reconnaissance car that American soldiers simply called the Jeep. 7,000 mi away, in a small factory office in Ohio, a 56-year-old freelance engineer named Karl had sketched the basic design of that vehicle in just 5 days. He had no staff of draftsmen. He had no time for elaborate testing. He had only a deadline that most experts considered impossible to meet. The United States Army had given American manufacturers 49 days to deliver a working prototype of a new light reconnaissance vehicle. Most companies refused even to bid on the contract, accepted the challenge, believed the Americans were incapable of producing weapons that could match German engineering excellence, and the workers who built 647,000 Jeeps were about to prove him catastrophically wrong. The German misjudgment of American industrial capability began years before the first Jeep rolled off an assembly line. Throughout the 1930s, German military intelligence compiled detailed reports on American manufacturing capacity, workforce quality, and national character. The conclusions they reached were remarkably consistent across every assessment. America was a nation of businessmen and salesmen, not soldiers and engineers. Its factories produced refrigerators and automobiles, not precision military equipment. Its workers were soft and lacked the technical training that German craftsmen possessed. This analysis seemed to be confirmed by observable facts. In 1939, the United States Army ranked 17th in the world. Total strength smaller than the armies of Portugal and Romania. American military spending had been gutted during the Depression years. The arsenals that would eventually produce weapons for half the world were still making consumer goods for department stores. When German engineers examined American automobiles, they found them crude by European standards. The tolerances were loose, the materials were cheap. Designs prioritized low cost over performance. German automotive engineers, trained in the precision manufacturing traditions of companies like Mercedes and BMW, looked at American cars and saw evidence of a nation that did not understand true engineering excellence. Ferdinand, the legendary Austrian engineer who had designed racing cars embodied this attitude of technical superiority. In 1938, began work on a military version of his. This vehicle would become Germany's primary light utility vehicle. Throughout the war, approached the project with characteristic precision. Every component was carefully engineered. Air-cooled engine eliminated the vulnerability of a water cooling system. The smooth underbody allowed the vehicle to slide over sand and snow like a sled. The independent suspension provided a comfortable ride even over rough terrain. That was by many measures a brilliantly designed vehicle. Its engine produced about 24 horsepower, but the car weighed only 725, making it nimble and fuel-efficient. German soldiers could physically lift and push when it became stuck. Air-cooled engine would not freeze on the Russian steppe or overheat in the North African desert. Had created an elegant solution to a specific military problem, but his German colleagues were solving the wrong problem. They were optimizing for technical excellence when they should have been optimizing for production volume. They were building watches when they should have been building hammers. The American approach to the same challenge could not have been more different. In June of 1940, with France falling to Germany and Britain fighting for survival, the United States Army began searching for a new light reconnaissance vehicle. The existing options were inadequate. Motorcycles with sidecars could not carry enough men or equipment. Trucks were too heavy and conspicuous. What the Army needed was something entirely new. A small, rugged, four-wheel drive vehicle that could go anywhere and do almost anything. On July 11, 1940, the Army sent specifications to 135 American automobile manufacturers. The requirements seemed almost impossible to meet. The vehicle had to weigh no more than 1,300. It had to carry a 3-man crew plus equipment. It had to have four-wheel drive for off-road capability. It had to reach speeds of at least 50 on roads while also crawling at walking pace off-road, and manufacturers had just 11 days to submit a bid and 49 days after contract award to deliver a working prototype. Established automobile companies looked at these requirements and declined. General Motors said no, Ford said no. The specifications were too demanding, the timeline too short, and the financial rewards too uncertain for any major manufacturer to risk its reputation on such a project. Only two small companies responded. One was Willys Overland, a struggling automaker based in Ohio that had barely survived the Depression. The other was the American Car Company, a tiny manufacturer in Butler, Pennsylvania, with a skeleton crew of workers. Was so small that most Americans had never heard of it, but Bantam was also desperate for business, and desperation breeds courage. As President Frank Fenn knew his company could not design the vehicle alone. He reached out to Karl, a freelance automotive engineer who had previously worked for companies including Chalmers, Peerless, and REO, was 56 years old, a graduate of Ohio State University and one of the most experienced automotive engineers in America. He was also unemployed and initially uninterested in the project. The pay was minimal and the deadline was impossible. Fenn convinced Probst to visit Butler anyway. When Probst saw the Army specifications, something changed in his attitude. He recognized that this was not just another commercial project. This was a chance to help his country prepare for a war that increasingly seemed inevitable. Probst agreed to help, reportedly for a total payment of $200. On July 17, 1940, Probst arrived at Bantam's factory and began work. He had 5 days to complete the design drawings needed for the bid submission. Working with engineer Harold Christ and a small team, produced a complete set of specifications. By July 22, the Army reviewed the bid at camp in Maryland and reached a decision in 30 minutes, won the contract. Now the real work began. Probst and Chris had 49 days to transform paper drawings into a working vehicle. They scavenged parts from existing automobiles wherever possible. The frame was built from scratch. The body was from sheet metal. Every component had to be fabricated, fitted, and tested. The men worked around the clock, sleeping in shifts on the factory floor. On September 23, 1940, Probst and Christ personally drove the completed prototype from Butler to camp. They arrived at 4:30 in the afternoon, just half an hour before the 49-day deadline expired. The vehicle weighed more than the original specifications allowed, coming in at approximately 1,850 pounds instead of 300, but when Army testers put it through its paces, the little car performed magnificently. Over the following weeks, the prototype logged 5,800 of grueling endurance testing. It climbed grades that stopped other vehicles. It forded streams. It crossed terrain that would have trapped a truck. The Army was impressed but faced a dilemma. Had proven the concept worked, but the company was too small to produce vehicles in the quantities the military would need, so the Army made a controversial decision. It forwarded its blueprints to both Willys, Overland, and Ford, claiming government ownership of designs created under federal contract. Both larger companies were invited to submit their own prototypes. By November 1943, versions of the new vehicle existed, had built its pilot models. Willys Overland had produced a prototype called the Quad. Ford had delivered its version named the Pygmy. The Army ordered 1,500 pre-production units from each company for field testing. What emerged from those tests would determine the future of military mobility. The Willys prototype had one decisive advantage. Its engine was superior to anything the competition offered. Chief Engineer Roos, known as Barney, had spent months refining a power plant called the Go Devil. This was a water-cooled 4-cylinder engine that produced 60 horsepower at 4,000 revolutions per minute. It was not a new design. Roos had actually modified an existing engine from the Willys automobile line, but his modifications were transformative. The original engine could run for roughly 22 hours under continuous load on a dynamometer before showing signs of strain. Roos redesigned almost everything to dramatically extend that endurance. He added insert bearings for durability. He counterbalanced the crankshaft to reduce vibration. He installed lightweight aluminum pistons. He created a full-pressure lubrication system. He redesigned the camshaft for better performance. When he finished, the Go Devil engine could run continuously on a dynamometer for over 100 hours. It produced more than twice the power of its engine. while maintaining the rugged reliability that combat conditions demanded. In July 1941, the Army made its decision. Willys Overland would be the primary manufacturer of the new vehicle, designated the MB. The company's engine and overall design had proven superior in testing, but Willys alone could not produce enough vehicles to meet military demand. Ford was brought in as a second source manufacturer, building identical vehicles under license. Ford designated its version the GPW with the letters standing for Government 80 in wheelbase and Willys license design. The common myth that GPW stood for general purpose is actually incorrect. Ford invested $4 million to retool its facilities for Jeep production. The company stamped every component it manufactured down to individual nuts and bolts with a script letter F to identify Ford-produced parts. The vehicles were otherwise identical to ensure complete interchangeability of parts in the field. Ford's first GPW rolled off the assembly line on January 2, 1942, less than a month after Pearl Harbor. The production numbers that followed represented one of the great industrial achievements in human history. Willys Overland built approximately 360,000 Jeeps at its plant between November 1941 and September 1945. Ford produced approximately 277,000 vehicles across 6 plants, adding its contribution of roughly 2,600 units and various pre-production models. Total wartime production reached approximately 647,000 Jeeps. At peak production, the Willys factory and produced one Jeep approximately every 80 seconds. Workers built between 280 and 300 vehicles per day on 2 assembly lines running continuously. The cost to the Army was $738.74 per vehicle. In modern terms, that would be roughly $13,500. Less than the price of a basic economy car. The scale becomes even more striking when compared to German production. Ferdinand's, despite its technical elegance, was never produced in large numbers. Germany manufactured only 50,435 during the entire war. Americans built nearly 13 Jeeps for every the Germans could produce. This ratio of 13-to-1 reflected a fundamental difference in how the two nations approached industrial warfare. Germany built weapons like a jeweler makes watches, with careful attention to every detail and a commitment to perfection that often delayed production and complicated maintenance. America built weapons like a factory makes hammers, with standardized parts, designs, and assembly lines that prioritized volume over individual excellence. A German tank might be superior to an American tank in one-on-one combat, but the Americans could produce 5 tanks for everyone. The Germans built superior numbers, eventually overwhelmed superior engineering. German forces encountered American Jeeps for the first time during the North African Campaign of 1942. Field Marshal's Afrika Corps was fighting British forces in the desert when American troops began arriving in force. The Germans quickly noticed the small vehicles that seemed to be everywhere in Allied formations. Jeeps carried officers to forward positions, they towed artillery pieces, they evacuated wounded soldiers, they mounted machine guns and served as mobile fire platforms. They performed dozens of different roles that German doctrine assigned to specialized vehicles. German soldiers who captured American Jeeps were immediately impressed by their capabilities. The 4-wheel drive system allowed the Jeep to traverse terrain that would trap the 2-wheel drive. The powerful engine could tow loads that could not move. The simple, robust design was easy to maintain, even in field conditions. German troops began using captured Jeeps whenever they could acquire them, classifying them as FAR, which translates to captured vehicles, or loot vehicles. The German military maintained a formal system for evaluating and deploying captured enemy equipment. Vehicles that proved useful were either pressed into immediate service or sent to rear areas for detailed examination by ordnance experts. American Jeeps were prized acquisitions. German soldiers reportedly believed that every American soldier was issued a personal Jeep because the vehicles seemed so numerous in Allied formations. This was an exaggeration, but it reflected the psychological impact of American industrial abundance. Photographic evidence documents German use of captured Jeeps throughout the war. The National World War II Museum holds a German propaganda photograph dated June 9, 1944, just 3 days after D-Day. The original German caption describes the capture of a Jeep from an Allied glider near Karl. Similar photographs from North Africa, Italy, And the Eastern Front showed German soldiers operating American jeeps they had seized from Allied forces. The most dramatic German attempt to exploit captured jeeps came during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. SS Lieutenant Colonel Otto, who had previously rescued Benito in a daring commando raid, was tasked with a new mission of unprecedented audacity. Operation named after the mythical Griffin would infiltrate German soldiers behind American lines, wearing American uniforms and driving American vehicles. Their mission was to spread confusion, misdirect traffic, capture bridges, and create chaos that would help the German offensive succeed. Requested 100 captured jeeps for the operation. He also requested American tanks, trucks, and enough uniforms and equipment to outfit a substantial force. The request itself reveals how desperately the Germans coveted American vehicles, knew that jeeps were the most ubiquitous vehicles in the American rear areas. His commandos would need jeeps to blend in with normal traffic, but they could not supply what needed. Despite scouring the entire front for captured American equipment, the Germans could only provide approximately 30 jeeps for operation. Received one working Sherman tank out of the 20 he had requested. The operation was crippled before it began by Germany's inability to accumulate enough captured American equipment. The jeeps that did obtain were assigned to small teams of English-speaking German soldiers organized into a unit called. These men had been selected for their language skills and were given intensive training in American customs, slang, and military procedures. Approximately 150 commandos were organized into small groups, each equipped with a captured jeep, American uniforms, and forged identification documents. The operation began on December 16, 1944, as the broader German offensive smashed into American lines in the forest. Teams infiltrated through the chaos of the initial breakthrough and began their mission of disruption. Some teams succeeded in misdirecting American convoys, others changed road signs, spread false rumors about German paratrooper drops. The operation generated tremendous paranoia in the American rear areas, but the commandos made fatal mistakes that revealed their true identity. Had loaded 4 men into each jeep, which was standard practice for the German. American crews typically rode only 2 or 3 per jeep. Once alerted to the infiltration, American military police began stopping any jeep carrying 4 occupants. Other teams were caught using British terminology like petrol instead of the American gas, or claiming to belong to organizational units that did not exist in the American military structure. On December 17, 3 German commandos were captured near in Belgium. They were driving a jeep and carrying German weapons in. Despite wearing American uniforms, under interrogation they admitted their mission and provided information about operation. All 3 men, Sergeant Perouse, Senior Officer Cadet Gunter Billing, and Corporal, were convicted of espionage and executed by firing squad on December 23, 1944. Operation ultimately failed to achieve its objectives, but it created extraordinary paranoia among American forces. Military police established checkpoints throughout the rear areas and interrogated anyone who seemed suspicious. Guards asked questions about American baseball, popular culture, and state capitals to identify infiltrators. Even American generals were sometimes detained until they could prove their identity. General Bradley was stopped at a checkpoint and had to answer questions about the identity of his husband before being allowed to proceed. The operation's failure highlighted a crucial truth about German industrial weakness. Had conceived a brilliant plan, but Germany simply could not provide the captured American equipment needed to execute it. This request for 100 jeeps and receipt of only 30 demonstrated how thoroughly American production had overwhelmed German capacity to even capture enemy equipment in useful quantities. The contrast between American and German industrial approaches extended far beyond the jeep. By 1944, the United States was producing approximately 2/3 of all Allied military equipment. American factories delivered 297,000 aircraft during the war. They built 86,000 tanks. They manufactured 193,000 artillery pieces. They produced 2 million army trucks. The scale was simply incomprehensible to German planners who had dismissed American production claims as propaganda. President Franklin had used the phrase "arsenal of democracy." Radio address on December 29, 1940, he declared that American industrial genius would be called upon to bring its resources and talents into action against the Axis powers. German Intelligence analysts dismissed this as political rhetoric when announced that American factories would produce 50,000 aircraft per year. The German High Command considered the figure laughably impossible. American military aircraft production in 1939 had been fewer than 3,000 planes total. Idea that output could increase by a factor of nearly 20 seemed absurd. The Germans were wrong. American factories not only met targets but exceeded them. Production reached 96,000 aircraft in 1944 alone. That single year's output exceeded Japan's total aircraft production for the entire war. The Jeep's success in the field matched its success in production. Soldiers found new uses for the vehicle that its designers had never anticipated. The official list of Jeep roles eventually numbered more than 20 distinct functions. It served as a reconnaissance car, an ambulance, a machine gun platform, a command vehicle, a wire laying platform, a railroad car when fitted with flanged wheels, an anti-aircraft platform, a mobile power source, an aircraft tug on carrier decks, a snow plow, and numerous other roles that emerged from the creativity of troops who needed to solve problems in the field. In North Africa, British Special Air Service commandos transformed the Jeep into a devastating attack platform. Each SAS Jeep was fitted with multiple Vickers K machine guns capable of firing over 1,000 rounds per minute. On the night of July 26 to 27, 1942, Major David Sterling led 18 Jeeps carrying approximately 60 commandos on a 50-mi desert raid against airfield. The raiders drove in two columns directly across the airfield, destroying or damaging 37 German and Italian aircraft in approximately 15 minutes. One SAS soldier was killed in the assault. 15 of 18 Jeeps returned safely. Over the North African campaign, the SAS destroyed nearly 400 confirmed aircraft on the ground using a force that never exceeded 600 men. RML reportedly nicknamed Sterling the Phantom Major in grudging respect for his effectiveness. On D-Day, Jeeps were among the first vehicles to land on the Normandy beaches. They came ashore from landing craft equipped with deep water-faring kits that allowed them to wade through several feet of surf. Others arrived behind enemy lines via Waco and Horser gliders. Brigadier General at 56, the oldest man in the invasion and the only general to land by sea with the first wave, came ashore at Utah Beach Inn. His Jeep, nicknamed Rough Rider, would die of a heart attack 36 days later, having earned the Medal of Honor for his leadership on the beach. In the Pacific Theater, a Willys MB, nicknamed Old Faithful, became the first Marine Jeep on Canal, landing on August 7, 1942. On October 13, the vehicle took 2 shrapnel holes from Japanese battleship shelling and was reportedly awarded the Purple Heart. Believed to be the first American vehicle so decorated, Old Faithful served 4 Marine generals, hosted visits from Secretary of the Navy Frank and Admirals Chester and William, and traveled 11,000 m of jungle terrain over 18 months before being formally retired by Marine Corps order on December 22, 1943. Testimonials from those who used the Jeep in combat remain among the most eloquent tributes ever given to a military vehicle. General Dwight Eisenhower wrote in his 1948 memoir Crusade in Europe that he considered the bulldozer, the Jeep, the 2.5-ton truck, and the C-47 airplane the most vital equipment for success in Africa and Europe. He noted with some irony that none of these items was designed primarily for combat. War correspondent Ernie Pyle, writing from North Africa on June 4, 1943, produced what became the Jeep's definitive tribute. Good Lord, Pyle wrote, I do not think we could continue the war without the Jeep. It does everything, it goes everywhere, it is as faithful as a dog, as strong as a mule, and as agile as a goat. It constantly carries twice what it was designed for and still keeps on going. Pyle also called it a divine instrument of military locomotion. He would be killed on April 18, 1945 on the island of near Okinawa. Pyle was traveling in a Jeep when it came under Japanese machine gun fire. He leaped into a roadside ditch for cover, but when he raised his head to look around, he was struck and killed instantly. Cartoonist Bill, who drove his own Jeep, named Genie more than 10,000 m through Italy and France while gathering material for the military newspaper Stars and Stripes, created one of the war's most iconic images. His cartoon showed a grizzled cavalry sergeant pressing his pistol against the hood of his disabled Jeep, covering his eyes. Before delivering the final shot, he was putting down his vehicle the way a cavalryman would shoot a horse with Broken leg, the image captured how deeply American soldiers had come to love their Jeeps. The Lend Lease program distributed American Jeeps to allies around the world. Approximately 50,000 Jeeps were shipped to the Soviet Union. Along with several thousand amphibious Ford GPA variants, Soviet soldiers called them Willys, a phonetic rendering of the Willys brand name. When asked how they liked the American Jeep, Red Army drivers often answered with one Russian word: marvelous. The Soviets received far more than Jeeps through Lend Lease. By the end of the war, approximately 33% of all Red Army vehicles had been provided by the United States. Thousands of rocket launchers were mounted on American truck chassis. At the conference in November 1943, Joseph spoke about the critical importance of American machines to the Soviet war effort. Later, wrote in his memoirs that told him privately that without American help, the Soviet Union would not have won the war. The German inability to match American production had roots in fundamental differences of industrial philosophy. German factories were organized around skilled craftsmen who took pride in precision engineering. Components were carefully machined to exact tolerances. Designs were constantly refined to incorporate improvements and innovations. This approach produced technically excellent weapons, but it complicated production and made maintenance difficult in the field. American factories were organized around assembly lines and interchangeable parts. Components were designed to be good enough rather than perfect. This approach allowed workers with minimal training to produce large quantities of reliable equipment. A part manufactured in Ohio would fit perfectly with components made in Michigan and assembled in California. The system sacrificed some technical excellence for massive gains in production volume and field serviceability. German weapons frequently suffered from that complicated production and maintenance. The Tiger tank, designed by after defeating a rival prototype submitted by, required approximately 300,000 man-hour to build. The Sherman tank was far simpler and could be produced in a fraction of the time. German tanks might win individual engagements, but American tanks could be replaced faster than they were destroyed. William, the former General Motors president who led American war production, later summarized the Allied victory in terms that would have horrified German strategists. "We won," said, "because we smothered the enemy in an avalanche of production, the like of which he had never seen nor dreamed possible." The Jeep was one component of that avalanche, but it was a component that touched every aspect of the war. Karl, the engineer who had sketched the original Jeep design in 5 frantic days, received little recognition for his contribution during his lifetime. He continued working as a freelance engineer after the war and never became wealthy from his role in creating the Jeep. Died in 1963, largely unknown to the public that had benefited so enormously from his work. Roos, the Willys overland engineer whose engine was decisive in the Jeep's success, continued his career in the automotive industry. He had spent a decade at before joining Willys and brought extensive experience to the engine redesign that proved crucial in winning the standardization contract. The engine remained in production long after the war and powered Jeeps well into the civilian era. The Willys factory in that had produced hundreds of thousands of Jeeps transitioned to civilian production after the war. The first mass civilian Jeep, designated the C-Gateway and rolled off the line in 1945. It was essentially military Jeep with minor modifications for peacetime use. The vehicle found immediate success with farmers, ranchers, and rural workers who needed its rugged capabilities. The Jeep brand eventually spawned the entire sport utility vehicle category that dominates American highways today. The men and women who built those Jeeps scattered back to their ordinary lives after the war. The welders who had fabricated frames returned to farms and factories. The assembly workers who had installed engines went back to jobs. The engineers who had solved impossible problems in impossible time frames moved on to new challenges. Most of them never spoke much about what they had done. They considered it simply their duty to a country at war. When generals surrendered in 1945 and named the Jeep as the American weapon that impressed them most, they were acknowledging more than the excellence of a single vehicle. They were acknowledging the failure of their entire strategic calculation. They had believed that German precision and training would prevail over American mass production. The evidence proved otherwise. The story of German officers examining captured Jeeps and coveting them carries lessons that extend beyond military history. It reveals the danger of measuring its potential by their past performance. German Strategists looked at America in 1939 and saw a nation unprepared for war. They concluded that this nation could not prepare, that its factories could not convert, that its workers could not adapt. They mistook a peacetime economy for permanent limitations, the industrial might that crushed Nazi Germany came from factory workers and who stayed on the job around the clock. It came from engineers like Karl, who accepted impossible deadlines and met them anyway. It came from companies like Willys, Overland, and Ford that transformed their operations in weeks to produce equipment they had never made before. It came from ordinary people who accomplished what experts had declared impossible. Ernie Pyle was right, we could not have continued the war without the Jeep. It did everything, it went everywhere. It was faithful as a dog, strong as a mule, and agile as a goat. 647,000 times, American workers proved that industrial democracy could outproduce totalitarian efficiency, that truth embodied in a boxy little reconnaissance car helped decide the fate of the world. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters, each one deserves to be remembered. Leave comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans the globe from veterans to history enthusiasts, and we would love to hear from you. Thank you for watching and thank you for keeping these stories